quite a bit to say, about the road to the Constitution. So I'm going to start in one of his famously self-effacing utterances. George Washington claimed, quote, "I'd rather be at home in Mount Vernon with a friend or two about me than to be attended at the seat of government by the officers of the state." For one glorious week, Washington was able to have it both ways. This talk is about that week in March 1785, when Washington hosted what historians have come to call the Mount Vernon Conference, one of the most important but least known steps along the way to the Federal Convention and the US Constitution. It is a story of wise and public-spirited personalities, some well known to history, others not, a story of petty local squabbles and huge constitutional principles, of dramatic suspense and tedious legalistic details. And like many great stories, it begins with a map. There were many maps of the Chesapeake available for public consumption in the 18th century. Chesapeake Bay, after all, was one of the most conspicuous indentations on the eastern seaboard. It played a large role in trade and commerce throughout the Atlantic world. This is one of my favorites of Maryland, dating from around the time of the Constitution. It's actually quilted, as you can see, and this is charming, but it's not this one that I want to focus on. Instead, I want to focus, for now anyways, on this map. It's a Dutch map from the same period because it better illustrates not only the vast extent of Chesapeake Bay, but the nearly inconceivable westward reach of one of its major tributaries, the Potomac River. Now, teachers and historians always employ maps at their peril. They can teach so much in one visual sweep, or they can lose an entire audience within seconds. I hope that's not you people. I'm assuming that almost everyone watching today lives just miles away from some stretch of Chesapeake Bay, and that you are already familiar with the general outline of this map. But the focus of this map, the bay, is where the story ends. Where the story begins is much further away, in a part of the interior that may not be so familiar to many of us, especially when we see it at this level of detail. Thomas Hutchins mapped the area in 1778 while serving as one of the Continental Army's surveyor generals. Washington owned the very map from which this detail is taken. It was the map he always referred to after the war, whenever he was discussing the West. But of course, he was referring to the map for the benefit of others. He was already intimately familiar with what it showed and what it hinted at. Remember, Washington had cut his teeth as a surveyor himself in the upper Potomac River Valley. Even without the aid of modern geospatial mapping, he had an on-the-scene awareness of the riches to be tapped by the vast Potomac watershed. More specifically, he knew how the Potomac offered access to the entire Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region through various portages from the Ohio and its major tributaries. For this reason, he always believed that the Potomac's navigation would prove of great political as well as commercial advantages. In his own words, quote, "It may tie the settlers of the Western Territory to the Atlantic states by interest, which," he wrote, "is the only knot that will hold, and the only motive that he trusted people to respond to, for better or for worse." It is easy to share Washington's enchantment from an aesthetic as well as a commercial point of view. The upper Potomac is indeed serene, but to get from there to the colonial ports downriver, like Georgetown, seen here, one had to contend with great falls, among other obstacles. Maneuvering around the falls brings us to the first of the several conferences, of which the Mount Vernon Conference was but one more leap on the way to the Federal Convention. The Alexandria Conference of November 1784 resolved to form a company for improving the navigation of the Potomac with the official and financial support of both Maryland and Virginia. To bypass the falls, the Potomac Company built canals that can still be seen today. I'm having trouble advancing. Any idea why I can't advance to the next screen, Jessica?
You might try coming back into it, see if that fixes it.
Okay, there we go. Good job. It's so great having someone who knows what they're doing. I appreciate it. Um, so the Potomac Company built these canals, of which this is some of the remnants. This can be seen at Great Falls on the Virginia side. The Revolutionary War hero, Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, was the public face of this enterprise, and he gave his wife's name to the town of Matildaville, which is where that particular canal was, again, along Great Falls, Virginia. Like his former commander-in-chief, Lighthorse Harry did not question the commercial or political significance of the Potomac. Indeed, he said the opening of the navigation of the Potomac is perhaps a work of more political than commercial consequence, as it will be one of the grandest chains for preserving the federal union. The Western world will have free access to us, and we shall be one and the same people, whatever system of European politics may be adopted. Already, Potomac boosters were looking ahead to see how politics would have to change in order to keep pace with the union that would come with economic collusion rather than collision. George Washington did not attend the Alexandria Conference, but he immediately forwarded its resolutions to State Delegate James Madison in Richmond, and he lobbied both the Virginia and Maryland legislatures, suggesting the expedience of a conference between delegates of both bodies to promote the conference's aims. And Richmond responded by appointing delegates to coordinate with Maryland commissioners about improving Potomac navigation and building a road between the river and what they called the Western Waters, with money to be apportioned between the two states. Washington himself picked the time and place for this next meeting. It would be in Annapolis, just before Christmas, 1784. It was only 1 year earlier, almost to the day, that Washington had passed through Annapolis to resign his commission on his way home to Mount Vernon. So let us call this first meeting the First Annapolis Convention, although, quote, convention is a rather grand title for what ensued. Virginia's delegates were only two, Washington and his former subordinate, General Horatio Gates. Gates was and still is famous as the victor of Saratoga, but his credentials for the task at hand rested on his ownership of a large estate near present-day Martinsburg, West Virginia. Everyone knew this meeting was Washington's baby, and much of the business undoubtedly fell on Washington's shoulders. Indeed, Gates at first begged off joining the meeting at all, on the grounds that, quote, you are so perfectly master of the business that my assent to your opinions is all I have to say upon the subject. Before it was over, the commissioners agreed on their state's mutual support for the Potomac Company, as well as the tolls to be charged, and discussed plans for building roads that would link the Potomac to the Western Waters, roads for which Pennsylvania's participation would be needed. It was Washington who forwarded the conference's proceedings to Richmond, pointedly noting that the Maryland legislature took only 1 day to ratify the results and pass the necessary enabling legislation. But there still remained some dispute over the jurisdiction of the Potomac and regulations governing its navigation, lingering questions which a joint commission had been appointed to address in 1778, but had to postpone because of the Revolutionary War. Let's look at the map again. The Potomac forms an emphatic boundary between Maryland and Virginia, Virginia being on the left in yellow and Maryland in the green. But if you stop to think about it for a moment, wrote one famous American historian, in an American history book for young people, he said, you will realize that a river is not a very good boundary. You cannot really use half of a river any more than you can use half of a horse. It was true that by colonial charters, Maryland owned the river up to the Virginia shoreline. On the other hand, Virginia's capes controlled the river's trade's access to the wider Atlantic market. So it was a complicated situation. Maryland legislators took the lead this time. Within a month, they appointed two veterans of what we're calling the First Annapolis Convention, Thomas Stone, Samuel Chase, and they added Stone's uncle and a future signer of the Constitution, Daniel of St. Thomas Jenifer, and Maryland's first governor, Thomas Johnson. Virginia had appointed her own commissioners for this long expected negotiation as early as June of the year before. Its equally impressive delegation consisted of George Mason, James Madison, who had sponsored Virginia's resolution establishing the commission in the first place, the state's Attorney General Edmund Randolph, and the merchant Alexander Henderson. I don't have a photo of Alexander Henderson. He remains the only relatively known name among all these commissioners, but at the time, he had so many mercantile outlets throughout Alexandria, Prince William, and Fairfax counties that he has been dubbed the father of the American chain store. The Marylanders wrote Virginia's governor that they would meet their counterparts from across the river in Alexandria, Virginia, on the 21st of March, 1785, unless they heard otherwise. Not hearing otherwise, they took for granted that the time and place was accepted, and they attended accordingly. And that's where a bureaucratic snafu threatens to end our story, because the Virginia commissioners were never told. George Mason would never have known about the conference if some of the Maryland commissioners hadn't written him about how much they looked forward to visiting him at Gunston Hall on their way to the meeting site. Ultimately, they bypassed Gunston Hall altogether and stopped at Mount Vernon instead. From there, George Washington, anticipating a farce about to unfold, quickly dispatched his own coach to fetch Mason and deliver him to Alexandria. There, Mason, Henderson, and 3 of the Marylanders found themselves on the appointed day, awaiting a 3rd Virginian that would complete the quorum required by the terms of their commission. When George Mason received a letter from fellow Commissioner Edmund Randolph that made no reference to the meeting, it was clear that he wasn't coming, and probably didn't even know about it. Mason would later speculate that there must have been some blunder or neglect in some of the public offices. Without the required 3rd commissioner, with no formal commission in their pockets, and with no instructions beyond what they could infer from prior conversations, Mason and Henderson thought it better to proceed than to disappoint the Maryland commissioners, who, Mason would later recall, appeared to have brought with them the most amicable dispositions and expressed the greatest desire of forming such a fair and liberal compact as might prove a lasting cement of friendship between the 2 states, which we were convinced it is their mutual interest to cultivate. That was George Mason. The worst part of this blundering business, as Mason called it, was his fear that he would have to go to Richmond to explain to the Assembly why they acted beyond their formal mandate. Mason hated leaving Gunston Hall, the thought of going to Richmond, and anyone who's been to Gunston Hall could understand why he would hate leaving it. Washington dined with the incomplete commission while it still waited in limbo in Alexandria. It was apparently at that time that he arranged with Mason and the others to have the deliberations moved to Mount Vernon in case no one else showed up. Washington's diary says Mason arrived from Alexandria on the 24th, according to appointment, quote unquote. Mason later recalled that the relocation was at their host's, quote, particular invitation. Maybe Washington had wanted the conference to meet at Mount Vernon all along and used the no-shows as just a pretext for inviting the commissioners to his smaller, more intimate venue. Perhaps Washington hoped to use the impressive and relatively isolated surroundings as a way to enhance Virginia's and his own weight in the scale of the proceedings. He might have done so just by his looming presence, as he did from the president's chair at the Federal Convention 2 years later. But I think Washington played an even larger role, certainly larger than what his most famous biographer, Douglas Southall Freeman, rather naively supposed was limited to supplying transportation and entertainment. The commissioners kept no minutes. Their host was also silent about their deliberations, a silence that may have served Washington's intention to downplay his role. Neither his correspondence nor his numbingly detailed diary shed any light on the marvelous things going on under his own roof. In the middle of a week spent planting and staking trees and laying out his precious garden paths, Washington's diary suddenly falls silent about the work around his estate, despite the fact that for the first time in 3 weeks, temperatures poked above the mid-50s. We don't know where they met. The so-called new room, perhaps, was the largest room, and certainly one that their host would have been most eager to show off, but it was not yet finished. Failing that, perhaps they met in the formal parlor, though I prefer to think of them enjoying the warm weather of the grand piazza. After 3 days of meeting, the Mount Vernon Conference concluded on March 28th. The last of the commissioners departed after breakfast the next morning. George Mason went home in Washington's carriage and sent it back to Mount Vernon with shoots of jasmine and roses for his gracious host, at which point the diary entries suddenly resumed the relentless litany of grafting and transplanting magnolias, pawpaws, and lilacs. Mason did not forward to the Virginia state authorities the resulting agreement known as the Mount Vernon Compact until December 7th. James Madison, as he had done all along, took responsibility for shepherding the business through the state's assembly, which ratified the results the day before New Year's. So what were the results? What in the end makes all this dramatic retelling so important? On the surface, it hardly sounds like the stuff of epic nation building. Virginia and Maryland each renounced any claim to tolls or duties on goods passing through their waters, but destined for the other state, declaring that the Potomac, quote, be forever considered as a common highway. Their merchant ships could use each other's ports for free in times of distress, such distress to be mitigated by the joint maintenance of buoys, lighthouses, beacons, and other aids to navigation. The compact established jurisdictions for trying cases of piracy and other offenses, ensured equal fishing rights in each other's waters, guaranteed that ships under a certain tonnage could trade in either state without a permit or port charges, and promised that owners of estates straddling both banks of the Potomac, like George Mason's family did, could carry their produce between their lands free of charge. The commissioners acknowledged other provisions that lay beyond their mandate. For example, they recommended that gold and silver be exchanged at the same rate on either side of the river, that import and export duties should be the same, and perhaps most consequentially, that the two states reappoint commissioners to meet annually every third week of September to coordinate further provisions and regulations. Lastly, they left it to their respective states to ask the Confederation Congress to ratify the compact, as is required of such interstate treaties by Article 6 of the Articles of Confederation. Despite Mason's and Madison's urging, the compact was not submitted to the Confederation Congress, a huge but all too common defeat for the relevance of the Confederation government. But Madison nevertheless saw some hope for revitalizing the Confederation in the form of those annual meetings agreed upon in the Mount Vernon Compact. To James Monroe, Madison predicted those prescribed meetings could be the embryo of, quote, a meeting of political commercial commissioners from all the states for the purpose of digesting and reporting the requisite augmentation of the power of Congress over trade. What the event will be cannot be foreseen. When Maryland ratified the compact, it extended invitations to these meetings to two other states affected by the Chesapeake watershed, Delaware and Maryland, who Madison believed will naturally pay the same compliment to their neighbors, and so on and so on and so on, unto the farthest reaches of the national government. It is there, hidden in that, et cetera, that Madison saw the promise of a wider application of the lessons of the Mount Vernon Conference. In fact, Virginia did extend the sphere ever wider by voting on January 21st, 1786, to open the meeting to all the states. 9 states responded to the call for a follow-up meeting in Annapolis over 4 days in September 1786. This time, states from as far away from the Potomac as New Hampshire and North Carolina heeded the call. And although only 5 states delegations showed up in time, among them were some, this is Annapolis at the time of the what was intended to be the Annapolis Convention. Among them were some heavyweights like our friend James Madison and New York's Alexander Hamilton, who will appear in any number of places throughout history. You never know where Hamilton's going to show up. The Annapolis Convention's report to the Confederation Congress called for another follow-up meeting with an even broader, in fact, an open-ended agenda, and that led to the Philadelphia Convention, also known as the Federal Convention, which created the US Constitution over 4 months in the summer of 1787. And the rest, as they say, is history. Now, I've tried to keep you all awake with these beautiful pictures, but for those of you who have not been paying attention, I should point out what subtly crept into America's constitutional development during those 3 days at Mount Vernon in 1785. Maryland and Virginia essentially agreed to what we today would call a bilateral free trade agreement. The 4 common elements of a bilateral free trade agreement are that the subscribing parties have similar gross national products, They share geographic proximity, engage in similar or compatible trade, and most importantly, share a political commitment to regional organization. And if that still doesn't seem like a sexy enough beginning of the road to the Constitution, consider the series of agreements that started relatively modestly with the integration of 6 European countries' coal and steel industries in 1952, and proceeded by increasingly regionally integrative steps to the creation of a continent-wide customs union and supranational institutions known today as the European Union. Similarly, the Mount Vernon Conference of 1785 eliminated regional boundaries to trade and the type of commercial one-upmanship that left Maryland and Virginia ships at the mercy of each other's regulation of the Potomac and the capes that controlled access to the entire Chesapeake Bay. The elimination of interstate barriers to trade may sound like a banal bureaucratic achievement, but it became the recognized impetus for a stronger bilateral, then regional, and ultimately national union, thanks in large part to the baby steps taken at the Mount Vernon Conference of 1785. There was a lot of stuff there, but if anyone has any questions or you want to look at one of the pictures again or something like that, I'm happy to talk about it with you and answer your questions. So I think Jessie might be taking over. She's in charge still. There you are.
Yes. Yep.
So
if anyone has any questions, anything you want to see again or go over, feel free to type those in the chat and we can get those questions answered for you.
I'll share something. This is not really relevant to the Potomac, but it's interesting. If you really pay attention to maps, and a lot of this talk is about maps, what do maps show us? What do they hide from us, and so on. So I knew this was a map of the first European Union as of 1952. And I'm like, oh yeah, I get it. There's West Germany, there's Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Italy. And then I noticed Northern Africa, and I realized this is 1952 and Algiers still belonged to France. So technically speaking, Algiers and all the African colonies of these 6 countries would have been, by extension, part of that union. So that's why that was listed. It's just always fascinating to pay attention to the details in maps. So
I found that first map you showed, the quilted one, really interesting. You can even see St. Mary's, of course, right on there.
Isn't that beautiful? I can't remember the age of the person who did it. I'm assuming it was the young girl, because that's how they practice their skills. I don't know Maryland's history as well as you guys do, so I don't know if any of these counties existed under. Well, here you go. It has Washington City. I think you can see roughly where Washington is, but it's considered part of Montgomery County and Prince George's County still. It's not a clearly delineated border, and that is in fact what the case was right up until 1800. Washington, D.C., even though it was designated the national capital, and for the first 3 or 4 months that it operated as the national capital, remained, for jurisdictional reasons, part of Maryland, part of Montgomery County and Prince George's County. In fact, for the first time and only time in history, DC people, well, up until the 1960s anyways, DC people voted in national elections for the president as citizens of Maryland.
I did not know that.
Yeah, well, that's really one of my specialties is what's called the Organic Act, the legislation that converted the federal district from Virginia, because of course it's still extended over into Virginia, what is now Arlington County, from Virginia and Maryland jurisdiction to its own federal exclusive jurisdiction. But I've written articles about that and how it didn't necessarily need to be that way. And lawyers sink their teeth into that kind of argument, and others like it, to show that, it's not inevitable that the federal district the residents of the federal district have no rights comparable to those of citizens of states, because they were in fact citizens of states for the first 4 months at least of its existence. So
It's
I'm glad you
fascinating.
like this map, Jesse. I like it too.
Yeah.
So,
So actually, I have questions.
all right.
So you mentioned this being an example of a bilateral free trade agreement. So would this have been the first example of that in the US?
In the US, I don't know. My knowledge of colonial history before the revolution doesn't extend that far, but being a good New Englander, we breathe this stuff in our youth. As I hinted at the beginning, we don't call it St. Patrick's Day. Technically, it's Evacuation Day. There were unions of the colonies. So there was a New England, I think it was called the New England Dominion, that existed for a while. They tended to be mostly for defense against Native Americans, typically, or the French in the north. I don't know what kind of economic arrangements were made. But the fact that Maryland and Virginia held so tenaciously to their prerogatives as sovereign powers within their borders, and even when there were not necessarily contested but overlapped borders, like they were with the Potomac, suggests to me that that was the norm. That you had supreme say. And of course, as the larger point of this talk is that the steps towards the Constitution involved, in large part, big questions about defense and a unified voice to speak to European powers and so on, but also breaking down those barriers to trade between states. And we know, for example, it's not a case of a bilateral agreement like we have with the Mount Vernon Conference, but we know that the duties that New Jersey had to pay to import goods. New Jersey had no huge port of its own, but right outside of its borders, across Raritan Bay in New York and across the Delaware River, there was Philadelphia, and they had to import most of their goods from these places. And the impost tariffs that were paid, it was another example of how clumsy the system was working. Now, we say it's clumsy looking back. To them, it was the norm. And this is always important to remember. When you're looking at history, you got to put yourself in their frame of mind. And when you do, you realize, I guess, okay, there might have been a Mount Vernon Conference, but it wasn't inevitable that there's an Annapolis convention. And it's only because people like Madison and Hamilton kept pushing and nudging, that we did have an Annapolis. And from Annapolis, that they kept pushing and nudging for the Federal Convention in Philadelphia. And probably many of your viewers know I referred to it as an open-ended agenda. Some people thought that was usurping its delegated powers, that it wasn't supposed to come up with a new constitution. It was just supposed to fix some of the hijinks going on under the Confederation. But of course, it ended up again because of individuals nudging and pushing it. And it didn't end with the Federal Convention creating this constitution. That was just the beginning. That's another whole story, the whole ratification process, when not 35 guys in a room, but 3.5 million people are discussing this document all of a sudden and its merits. But I chose the Mount Vernon Conference because it was one of those baby steps, and I love looking at baby steps the same way adults like looking at babies. They might not articulate it, but at some point they're wondering, what is this kid going to grow up to be? So anyways, I tried to include some really interesting images and maps. I imagine most of them, at least the portraits, are familiar to some of the people watching, but certainly some of the names were new to me. And I know this period, and Henderson, the father of the chain stores.
Yeah.
I never. Of course, there had to be some guy who first thought of chain stores, and of course, it was a Virginian. So, anyways, I really enjoyed doing the work, doing the research on this. So,
I have a question.
Yes.
What is the history of Maryland having the control over the whole width of the Potomac, as opposed to prior to this? Prior.
My understanding is that the colonial charters gave it the jurisdiction right up to the banks of Virginia, and that would have been something worked out between the Lords Baltimore or whoever the proprietors were of Maryland at the time. But you know, we still see remnants of this. I can't remember when I learned the story, and it's probably apocryphal, but the fact that stories are apocryphal doesn't mean they don't have any merit or anything instructive to say. So because Maryland has jurisdiction right up until the Virginia shoreline, and it's probably something really arcane that you know, early modern lawyers love to discuss, like, oh, it's got to be up to the shoreline at low tide during a full moon, the first full moon of spring or something like that. But generally it's to the shoreline. And of course we know that the shoreline has been built out from Virginia. For example, National Airport is a bump out from the original Virginia shoreline. And my understanding is that for a while anyways, National Airport was still considered Maryland property, to the point where they would send over Maryland firefighters to deal with situations that were arising. Now, this would have been early on, because I know that there's been a regional transportation authority that deals with these things. And someone who studies transportation would probably know that in itself was one of the motivations for having regional, like the Port Authority in New York as an example. You know, that's a tri-state conglomeration. So when you're dealing with transportation, much like trade, which relies on transportation, you have to deal with a regional perspective, or you have problems like building into Maryland territory from Virginia territory, and no Virginians wanting to go into that to fight fires, for example. So yeah, it's all very important, and it's all related to the colonial charters. And I know books have been coming out recently about the borders of states. I haven't read any of them because I feel like it would be too much fun, and I haven't deserved that much fun in a while. But I would love to read one of these books about how states got their shapes and why the Maryland original charter from 1600s went all the way up to the Virginia shoreline. So
in the 30s and 40s, down Colonial Beach, they had the slot machines on piers, and that they were in Maryland, and they'd have fights and trouble. And the sheriff from Maryland, they had to drive up to DC because there's no bridge down there. Harry Nice Bridge wasn't available. They drove up to Alexandria, then all the way around, like 3 or 4 hour trip to pick up some of these people and haul them back to jail.
That's the perfect example. I didn't know that. I'm going to add that to my list. And that's not apocryphal. I mean, that's recent history. Not that you would necessarily know, sir, but from firsthand experience. But that sounds reasonable. That sounds in line with what I had heard about National Airport, for example. And it's true what they say about, jurisdictions falling through the middle of a river, like the Delaware River. I know if you're going over the Delaware Bridge at some point, actually, I shouldn't say that. I'm not sure. At some point going over the Delaware Bridge, you see a sign that says entering Delaware or entering New Jersey, whichever direction you're going. And it's the air rights that are going straight out from wherever the border is. And I can't remember if it's in the middle of the river or which coast it's on. But it's fascinating how states rigidly adhere to these, what must be irrelevant to a tanker driving up through the middle of the river, which state they happen to be in at the time. So anyways.
So Michelle said in the comments, I've read Washington wanted to extend the Potomac all the way through the Ohio Valley. Mm-hmm. Were the plans for funding the outcomes of that initial meeting Maryland?
The funds, excuse me, say it again.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So it's read Washington wanted to extend the Potomac all the way through the Ohio Valley. The plans for funding this project, one of the outcomes of that initial meeting.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't know about a canal going to the Ohio Valley, but as I said, one of the results of the of the meeting was that they agreed to build a road or try to build a road. And if canal sounds daunting, it's not much more daunting than building a road through particularly that part. If any of you have been to that part of Maryland where it joins with the northern panhandle of West Virginia and so on, it's so savage, you know, and it would have been very, very difficult. I don't know. I haven't done a lot of follow-up about how much the states, because how much each respective state actually contributed. Because you might have noticed, if you were paying attention to dates, this stuff is happening very, very quickly, especially when you consider how slow news moved back then. So for them to have a conference in September and the state legislatures don't even find out about it for 3 months, and then they may or may not appropriate funds, and so on and so on. And all this is happening between, say, 1784 and 1789, when the Constitution's ratified. That's really, I think that's pretty significant. By the way, I'd be curious if anyone has been to what has got to be the smallest state park. And I'm embarrassed, I don't know which state it is a part of, but where the Potomac starts, of course, like most big things, it starts in this teeny little spring, and they have a state park built around the spring, and you could throw a huge stone across the state park. That's how small it is. But it's one of those places where, wow, this is where it all started. This little spring right at this tip where you see all these colors coming together. So, any other questions or comments about the images? I probably spoke a little fast, so if anyone, I'm just noticing what time it is. If anyone didn't hear me, I apologize, but I certainly also invite Jesse to share my email address. If any of you want to get in touch with Jesse there at the library, if you have any other questions, you want to bounce some ideas around, feel free to email me. I'm happy to talk more about it. So.
Yeah, everyone should have my direct email from when I sent you the link for tonight. So definitely, if you have any follow-up, feel free to shoot me an email and I can get that to him.
Yeah. If I still have a few minutes, to me, I was trying to treat something as snoozy as the Mount Vernon Conference as a kind of an adventure, as a detective tale, because like most weekly documented historical episodes, you have to read into the primary source evidence that exists. In my case, what we really had was the diary of George Washington. And the fact that, this very diligent, assiduous diary keeper suddenly stops making diary entries while these people are meeting at his house. I made an inference from it. Other people might disagree with the implications of that absence. That famous historical adage that the absence of evidence is not the absence of evidence is not evidence of an absence. It's just that we don't have. But in this case, it's a diary. We have the whole diary. The fact that there isn't text, I think, allows us to read into the fact that Washington was preoccupied during those days. He wasn't simply a host. He was probably actively engaged in what was going on during those meetings at his house. And it's that kind of detective work that is very intriguing. You don't have to be a trained historian. You just have to be mindful that there are lots of ways of looking at a document, and the superficial way of just glancing to see if something's there, what it says, isn't the end of the story. The fact that it doesn't say something when it should is also part of the story. And in this case, it invites us to make some inferences about Washington's role in what was a very important event. We know that Washington, by the time of the Federal Convention, he's the necessary man. He's the only one who could be president of the convention and have some kind of hope of being in any way successful. But this is several years before that. And although he's very prominent in the affairs of the Potomac Company, he's obviously not willing to be the face. Every time this bilateral trade concept comes up, he doesn't want to be the only face of it. And so it's in his interest to recruit other people to help carry the load. So I wasn't surprised that he wasn't the main guy. But I wasn't surprised either that he ended up hosting it at Mount Vernon. That seemed like the kind of a Washington type of thing to do, to work behind the scenes, to influence events. Yeah. Anything else? I'm glad you guys are all experts now on the Mount Vernon Conference of 1785. You can wow your friends. Once COVID is over, we're actually getting together with people again. They'll wish COVID was back, that you wouldn't bother this way. But you can jazz it up and make it exciting too. I hope I've done some of that, thanks to the illustrations anyways. And thanks to Jesse for giving me the chance to share research that I actually did about 10, 15 years ago. And I was just waiting for a neat chance to give it. So the residents of St. Mary's County seemed like a perfect kind of audience for this. So we good?
For doing it. And yeah, in the chat I see they said thank you, very interesting, great talk, thanks, very interesting, thank you. And the images really helped picture what you were discussing. So thank you for that.
Whoa, yay. Don't be afraid of maps. I know with these things, people don't even need to know which direction they're going in. I mean, it's maddening, but they can be beautiful. They can be aesthetic maps. They can certainly still, lead us to the destinations, but they're also just nice to look at sometimes. So I'm glad you like the illustrations. And thanks again, Jesse.
Of course. And yep, again, if you guys have follow-up questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And yeah, Chuck, thanks again.
Sure. Ciao.